Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Perpetual Chess. We have an engaging and knowledgeable guest who I'll be introducing momentarily. I also wanted to give a shout out to our presenting chess education sponsor, Chessable.com. While you guys breathlessly wait for my course to come, which I will be recording around the time that you hear this, you can make do with courses by the likes of Anish Giri on the Grunfeld. Ben Feingold's got a course coming out any day now on the Nimzo. And the list goes on. Of course, as I mentioned before, the Quality Chess Catalog is making its way to Chessable as well. So be sure to check them out. And if you sign up for Chessable Pro, use the link in the description. As for my guest this week, he has built his own chess business. He came to chess as an adult and has taken a particular interest in the science of chess visualization. He's read extensively on how it works, and I've been enjoying his blog posts about it for over a year now. He's developed a lot of tools to help adult amateurs learn how to improve their visualization skills. You can check out his blog and his website called Don't Move Until You See It. And over the years, I've gotten a good amount of questions about how chess visualization works. Of course, I wrote about it a bit in my book, but I'm excited to chat with someone who's gone much deeper down the rabbit hole. So without further ado, let's welcome Aiden Rayner to the pod. Welcome, Aiden.
Thanks, Ben. It is an absolute thrill to be here.
Yeah, excited to chat. You're joining me from beautiful Melbourne, Australia.
Yeah, and it's not that beautiful today. It's kind of dreary and horrible out there.
Oh, really?
It's That's all right. We're middle of winter.
Yeah,
So.
And it's beautiful and sunny here in New Jersey, so I guess the shoe's on the
jealous.
other foot. But nonetheless, I'm willing to trade places with you, all in all.
Fair enough.
If I could bring my whole network at least. But anyway, Of course, the order of the day, Aiden, is chess. And I wanted to dig right into visualization. So I've been reviewing your blog posts. I mean, it's really impressive, the degree of research you've done and the output, the amount of words you've written, because we've been corresponding off and on for over a year. And I came across something that you said that I thought would be a good place to start, which is that you don't like the term visualization when it comes to chess. So have at it, Aiden.
No. Yeah, so the term visualization, I'm not a fan of it. Not a fan of it in the kind of modern chess realm. I understand where it came from. I understand why that's the word we use. But for me, visualization is an incorrect term for describing what's actually occurring. Because at its core, visualization does not actually have to be in any way visual. We don't need to see pictures in our head in order to calculate, in order to play blindfold chess. And many strong players throughout history haven't seen pictures in their head to do those things. I prefer the word conceptualization. The idea is having a concept of the position, having an understanding of what's occurring, whether that's visual, whether it's verbal, whether it's whatever form it takes. That's really the key. And the word visualization leads a lot of people who I think are generally more verbal thinkers, process complex information in more verbal ways, leads them to spend a lot of energy trying to force a picture to happen, when if they instead lent into what their brain naturally does really well, they'd find that clarity much easier to come by.
Yeah, and in your work, you've come across, I feel like you found some kindred spirits, because I hadn't thought about that distinction before, but you found people who say, oh, thank goodness you're talking that way. Could you do any stories come to mind of people who learn in a different, like aren't able to see the board, but are still able to play?
So the others are like where I sort of stumbled into the idea is I naturally have known for a long time I'm not the most visual of people. I'm a musician as a background. I love words and language, and I process things in a very verbal way. And I hadn't really thought about that in any kind of conscious way, but I was sort of approaching chess that way when I came into it. But the big sort of moment for me was learning about George Koltanowski, the sort of legendary American, I think Belgian-American grandmaster who set blindfold Simmel world records in the 30s. And I ran into some stuff about him where he was talking about how he doesn't see a picture in his head. Instead, he would use what he called his mental gramophone. So he would record the moves as he heard them in his mind, and then he would play them back like a gramophone. which it seems insane for
Right.
for a lot of people. How do you even do that? Like, how's it even and I was also looking at some other research done kind of very early, like 1890s, around visualization and what it should be. And it seemed very different to what Koltanowski was doing. Then I learned about other people that were doing other things, like Alyekin very rarely used imagery. He used his logical memory, is what he called it. And there's all these different ways of doing it that weren't sort of being discussed at all. So I started basically telling Koltanowski's story. I started talking about that and trying to understand why, like the science behind how this is possible. And then, people started coming out of the woodwork going, oh my goodness, this is why I've always struggled with this. And a big moment with the Chess Journeys podcast, where I was speaking with Kevin and realized in that interview, so if he really interviews aphantasia and doesn't see pictures in his head either, and we ended up having this big conversation about that. It's been really fun kind of bringing that extra perspective to it. I think adults in particular resonating with some of that message.
Yeah, I heard that interview with Kevin, and it was like he was like coming out of the closet, and he was so glad to have a receptive audience. And then, I mean, and obviously, I was impressed with your knowledge of the topic, even not knowing going in that Kevin. I don't know how to properly characterize aphantasia, but basically the definition, correct me if I'm wrong, Aiden, is basically that you can't see pictures when you close your eyes. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like the kind of classic metaphor for it is the computer's working, the monitor's not on.
Okay. Yeah. And Aiden, so you got into chess during the pandemic, correct?
Yeah.
And what was it about visualization that grabbed you?
So I've got a bit of a deconstructed learning background. It's not quite background. So I'd done it to a bunch of different skills. Like I was a Josh Waits fan before I got into chess, because I loved his work and Tim Ferriss's work and the guys on like how to break a skill apart and learn it faster than you're meant to. And I'd done it with a few different things, never done it with anything as complicated as chess, but it was lockdown and I'd started to play and I started to do all the normal things to get better, the stuff that Reddit, YouTube and stuff were telling me to do. And it wasn't really working. So I went, okay, well, nothing to lose. Not like I've got anything else going on. How about I just try and deconstruct chess and see where I get? And did a bunch of research with that. And I found videos, one particularly from Hikaru. Much more recently, there's been a great one from Fabi, talking about how visualization is the most important part of the game. And then I was looking at the courses and the YouTube videos and the books and stuff that I had, and people, like, it was an afterthought if that was mentioned at all. And like no one was studying it directly. I watched a Gotham chess clip where he said that someone asked him how did he calculate this line to the end, how did he visualize that? And he goes, oh, you just get that by playing thousands of games.
Right.
And I'm like, there's something, if the top people saying this is the most important skill and nobody is actively focusing on it to train, there's something wrong with that.
Yeah, and he left out the part where you have to be 10 when you do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that definitely helps.
Right.
So I just sort of started messing around with that. Like, well, this is a really important thing. I'm not getting anywhere doing stuff I'm meant to be doing. So how about I just try this? That same video from Hikaru, maybe it was a different one, he talked about blindfold chess being the best way to learn visualization. So me as a 750 blitz player or whatever I was, tried blindfold chess and it went about as well as you'd expect. But I took it one step further and went, well, blindfold chess doesn't just target the right thing. Like I'm trying to train visualization. But how about I just remove all the decisions from blindfold chess? How about I just record myself reading moves and then listen back to them and try and follow the game? So I started doing that and just doing that for 10 to 15 minutes each day before I played. And I jumped 500 points in 6 weeks doing that. So I was like, okay, so something's happening. and then gave it to a few friends, and they didn't get the same level of results, but they got very encouraging results. I had one guy did some blindfold exercises for 10 minutes and then jumped 300 points in puzzles. And I was just like, okay, so there's something here. And that's when sort of the business idea started. And I've spent the last 3 years trying to understand why this stuff works. And that's that story. And I'm somewhat familiar with your website. You gave me a tour a while back. But being that I'm lazy, for lack of a better term, when it comes to my chess, I haven't been keeping up with it, I have to say. Could you there is one tool that I've used, which I'll discuss in a minute, but could you give us a brief audio tour of what sort of tools you've put there? Yeah, fantastic. So I see the kind of the skill of visualization, conceptualization, as kind of the muscle of chess. The stuff that you can learn in books is the knowledge component, but we need the muscle to actually be able to use it. It doesn't matter like how good you are at endgames if you keep forgetting that pawn exists. Like there's these sort of the issues that run into. So my stuff on the site and through the news and things are focusing on different parts of that muscle. So I'm very dedicated to making sure people understand the why. So we have a lot of like newsletter content explaining the science, explaining the kind of reasons behind this stuff, and helping people understand what's happening in their brain when they make silly blunders or when they do something that disappoints them. Then in the site itself, I've got a ton of different types of exercises that are focused on different parts of the conceptualization skills. So some of them are about understanding threats when they show up. Some of them are about helping your brain keep track of square control as a particularly tricky thing. Some of them are noticing combinations, various things. And some of them are blindfold, some of them are not blindfold, but they're all focused on putting your brain under enough pressure to force your brain to create the systems, create the processes, and become more efficient at handling chess information, so that you're playing games, you don't forget stuff anymore, and you can calculate clearer and all those things. Yeah, and the tool that I referenced was, I was just messing around with your blindfold tool that you have on your site, which I haven't seen one set up the same way as yours, because I've mentioned, and I think I even wrote about this briefly in my book, it's the fact that a lot of the like Lee Chess and chess.com, as far as I know, when they do when they have a blindfold chess setting, you can still see the board. Which really does not mimic the experience of blindfold chess. Now, exactly. It might help your chess. It certainly won't hurt your chess. But it's very different. Whereas the way that yours is set up is you tell it a move and then it verbally responds. So you're just sitting there and it's like you have a playing partner. So I like that about it. Yeah. The other thing I liked about it was that it fell for the trap in the Petrov, where you get to play like knight c6, discover check, and win the queen. So I felt like, I'm a genius. I can play blindfold chess because I got the queen on the sixth move, which is love it. Good gratification. Well, congratulations. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. That the thing about the board, so a board with invisible pieces, doesn't do the same thing. Doesn't even come close to doing the same thing. Because the board itself is such an important part of how our brain is engaging with the game of chess. In a lot of my work, I find that people, before they train these things directly, their brain does weird things. And as some of the listeners might relate to some of this, like some people seem to add files in their mind. So the D file and the F file, as far as their mind is concerned, are further apart than they actually are. Or some people drop files, like they see C and F as being much closer than they are. And these sorts of things, your eye is obviously recovering from a lot of this guys doing it. But anytime, that's a lot of pressure for your eye. Right. So if your brain is like removing or adding files in your kind of mental representation of the board, then diagonals become weird. Knight movement becomes real strange. And when you're under pressure and you're relying much more on that intuitive, quick thinking process, like your brain is operating on slightly warped information, which leads to all the issues that people have with knight and diagonals and all of that stuff. it's sort of, it's a strange thing. It's like why I love blindfold training so much, because when you take away the crutch of the eyes, you actually get a full, like you get to really understand how your brain is engaging with the information on the board, and you can see those weaknesses, those blips, and those kind of parts that are warped, those parts that are strange. And then those tend to translate into like, okay, well, that's why you keep making these sorts of mistakes under pressure, because you're missing these tactically, especially on diagonals, because you're adding or removing these files, or because you don't have a strong sense of how the diagonals are happening on the board or whatever. Blindfold training just show that how the brain's engaging with the game, and what sorts of mistakes can come out of that.
Yeah, and you've been writing recently in your 7 slot series about sort of the nature of mistakes, and I definitely want to return to that. But that is tangential, like it's definitely related. But let's drill down a little bit more on visualization, because I actually have 2 different questions from Patreon subs. So thank you to Adam Bryant for helping to support Perpetual Chess. Much appreciated. So Adam asks, and this is a question that I think comes up a fair amount. Adam has definitely encountered something that others have as well. He writes, in your research, did you find any empirical or evidence-based insights about visualizing in 2D as opposed to 3D? I ask because I've predominantly learned, studied, and played chess in 2D, but when I recently began playing OTP tournaments, my 2D trained eyes were utterly unprepared for the 3D board before me. I was like someone who had only studied painting trying to suddenly become a sculptor, and naively thinking that the former would prepare me for the latter. But after a few disastrous OTP games, I was disabused of that notion.
Yeah, I love that metaphor. The painter suddenly find themselves having to be a sculptor.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, fantastic. So now we're stepping into what I call conceptualization models. If you look up what should you see in your head, that 2D versus 3D question seems to be the main question that people have online. I'll add like a little caveat's the wrong word, but we all exist on a spectrum from hyper-visual thinkers to hyper-verbal thinkers. So up one end of the spectrum, you might have someone who, when they close their eyes, they see all 64 squares in sparkling color. They can see all the pieces and all the squares, and they can move things around in their head. Lefonghois was one of those. I use one of those. Grandmaster Fritz Samish seems to have been one of those. A lot of grandmasters don't think those people exist. I think that that's impossible, but that's one of the great things of this like entire realm of study, is that everyone thinks that what their brain does is what everyone's brain does. So there's a lot of people out there saying this is the only way it happens, and people who say this are wrong. And it's like, well, brains are different. So you got hypervisual people and you got hyperverbal people, who like people like Koltanowski don't have any pictures at all, and kind of everything in between. On the visual side of the spectrum, the question of 2D or 3D does become relevant, but I wanted to add that little caveat for anyone who is like naturally more of a verbal thinker. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
If you're not seeing anything, you don't have to force either one of them. If it's fuzzy, you don't have to force anything. But for the people who are strongly visual and kind of have almost like a photographic sense of the board, neither one is necessarily better, but ideally you want your mental representation to match the one that you care more about. And that will come just with experience and exposure. Lefong is a great example. I had a wonderful chat with him, and he's the hypervisual, sees everything. When he was professional and doing the tournaments all the time and all of that stuff, his board was 3D. Once he became a streamer and that was his focus, it slowly shifted to 2D. It seems to be whatever our main mode is how our brain sort of reacts to that. So if the one you care about is over the board, you want to spend more time with a physical board and physical pieces and get your brain used to that. Because even though it's a small factor, that translation process does take energy, it does take effort, and it can cause mistakes. It's just like a little like extra tax on every part of processing that your brain has to do if you're trying to translate back and forth with your mind.
And do you really think it cuts both ways? Because, I come from the generation where almost all of us were 3D learners, whether we wanted to be or not that way. I mean, you might read from a book, but you weren't playing on screens, until 1993 at the earliest or something. And a lot of people obviously have somewhat seamlessly integrated computers into their study regimens and their practice regimens and certainly their blitz addiction regimens. And they seem to be able to do that without much issue. But as you say, it's the other way around is like the most common question for people who've come to chess in the past 5 years. So do you think it for sure cuts both ways, or is it maybe something specifically about translating from screen to 3D?
I think it cuts both ways. That sense of it cutting both ways, sort of an anecdotal sense I've picked up rather than anything that is necessarily studied directly, to my knowledge. But it's kind of thing of if that translation has to occur in whatever form. So if you've come up sort of a more traditional thing with 3D boards and you're playing over the board all the time and then you shift screens. I think we saw this happen a lot and still do with like the older generation of players. Their strength drops a bit as they go to online.
Certainly,
and
with Kramnik.
I think a big part of that, and I think a big part of that is that translation. It's his mind. If he is a visual thinker, which most of the kind of top grandmasters are, we can go into why if we want at some point. But the mental representations probably leaning towards the 3D side of the things, and the little extra tax on every bit of processing, every bit of recognition, every bit of whatever that he has to do when he goes to a screen. And those small things add up. They don't add up enough that I could ever beat Kramnik,
right?
But they add up enough that sort of people at Kramnik's level over the board or whatever can sort of get an edge. So
and I guess just thinking out loud, like the fact that stronger chess players have been studying on ChessBase since the 1990s. Maybe they had a bit of a softer landing where like they were trained 3D, but they've been incorporating screens for decades. Whereas if you learn on a screen during the pandemic and then go to play OTB, it's like baptism by fire. You're just all the way in right away. So that might be part of it again. And then of course there's always Hikaru who like breaks every rule and just is amazing at both of them.
He's insane. I love that guy. Like just he's just so interesting to watch. With like the fact he just like seamlessly drops back and forth. I have no idea how he does that. It's very. I mean, Magnus can do the same thing. He just doesn't do it as publicly. Yeah,
and Hikaru's always funny in interviews because he's always like, "Yeah, you just learn by playing," and it's like, "No, you learn by playing." Like, that doesn't mean that the rest of us can do what you do. But anyway,
no, that works if you played constantly since you were 6.
Right?
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, less so for us. It's
right.
Adult learning is not a weakness. We just can't do it the same way. We have to approach things differently. So yeah, it's a lot of thing. And that's also where the visualization thing comes from. There's a lot of evidence suggest that pretty much all kids are visual, and the shift towards being a verbal thinker happens kind of over the course of puberty. And we settle down somewhere in the mid-20s, and some people shift and some people don't, and some people land wherever. But skills that you've picked up as a kid that were hyper visual. So if you're really strong visually, sort of learning visually as chess as a kid, and then even if the rest of your brain goes verbal, the part that handles the chess, if it's uninterrupted and it continues to be trained, will stay visual. So we end up with this really interesting spot where a lot of the sort of stronger players, even though some of them might not necessarily be visual in their general life, how they approach most problems, will still be quite visual in their chess because they learned that skill when they were kids and continued, which I think is also why we have this lack of understanding of verbal thinkers in chess for this adult wave that's coming through, because most of the people who teach chess are visual because most of them learned when they were kids. And we've got this sort of misunderstood group of verbal thinkers coming in, which is about 40% of us lean on the verbal side.
That's interesting.
It's not a small percentage.
Yeah, I apologize. I've probably told this story before on the podcast, but listen, I've been doing this for 8 years. I only have so many stories. But I actually, hearing you say it, I think I fall in the the verbal learning category. And the reason I think this is when I use a GPS, when my wife and I use a GPS when we're driving, I always want to follow the text instructions, and she's always looking at the map. And she thinks it's absolutely insane that I just want the word by word directions. And I think kind of in a perfect world, I think she's right. You know, it makes more sense to look at the actual world rather than like the list of things. But that's the way I'm wired. But in chess, I did learn when I was 12. I mean, I started when I was 6, but I started playing tournaments when I was 12. And I think it was just young enough where I can sort of overcome it. And I pictured chess visually.
Oh, nice. Cool. Yeah, so you might be in that kind of that window where it's able to sort of see. Also, like mid-spectrum is a thing. So most of us are somewhere in the middle with like a leaning one way or the other.
Yeah.
Like there's that classic story of like seeing Eric Rosen talks about this, like what happens in his head. And that's quite a common one, is the idea of a flashlight in a dark room. So you sort of see what's happening over in this quadrant in your mind, and then what's happening over here and what's happening over here, but you're linking everything through like logical and verbal links. And that's what I would call like a mid-spectrum visual model. So it's like, it's not entirely visual. There's a logical component to it. And a lot of us are sitting in category, those sorts of areas as well. But yeah, if you're strongly visual thinker, but otherwise quite verbal, then you're an example of what we're talking about. It sounds like the rest of your brain went one way, but the chess skill continued on the trajectory it was.
Yeah. I mean, I suspect it has something to do with like childhood development. Like they say, if you don't like pick up a language by the time you're 10, your odds of like not having an accent are tiny, you know? But if you do learn it at a certain age, it's a much greater chance that you sound like a native speaker. Okay, so we've got one more question on these lines, and this one is from Michael Spisner. Thank you for helping to support Perpetual Chess, Michael. And he says he'd like to hear you talk a bit about narration, by which he means telling yourself a story about the game moves rather than visually presenting them in your mind. And then he says, as an alternative to visualizing these moves, as a primarily verbal learner, are there things I can do to get better at the skill of remembering moves by narration?
That's a great question. So it can kind of be strange to get a head around this idea of keeping track of so much information that we generally deal with visually with our eyes without the image component. And that understanding the story of the position is a big part of that for me. That's my take on what Alyekin called his logical memory. So the way Alyekin would handle things, to my guess, based on what I've sort of been able to pick up, my guess is he was mid-spectrum verbal. So he had an element of visual in his model, but generally he held things through stories and his logical memory. His logical memory was a process of logically working out what must be true about the position based on what he knows about the position. So he would keep track of what the core threats are, what the main sort of thrust of a position is, and he would let certain details slip in the moment until he needed them again. So if he needed to remember where his B pawn was, whether it was on B2 or B3, he would remember that earlier in the game he had to stop the knight from coming C4. Therefore, the pawn must be on B3. And he would do this sort of stuff to keep track of the less directly critical positions, like piece a position back together based on the story of what's occurred so far. But he would always remain crystal clear about what the actual threats in the position are. So what's looking at what, where is the pressure, what's going on? And he would do this in a kind of narrative sense, like the logic of it rather than the image. Alyekin would use images here and there, but he would do it to double check things. So if he had a really complex sort of kingside attack on the go, he'd have a sense of what he thinks he wants to do with it, and he would like flash a visual, is the way he described it, just to double check where everything is visually, and then the visual would go away again, and you'd go back to that narration thing. As far as what can you do to build that strength, so the narration side of things, the key thing is to put brain in situations where it has to come up with something. That's why blindfold training is so useful, because in order for your brain to have any hope of actually like following the moves of a game that you can't see, then it has to do something. And my big thing is, especially for adult learners, is your brain knows what it wants to do. It doesn't see much of a difference between chess information and any other kind of complex information it has to process and deal with. And as adults come into the game, we've got decades of experience handling all kinds of complex information in other fields. What we need to do is put our brain in a position where it has to come up with something, focus on understanding what's happening in that sort of blindfold game or that blindfold position or whatever, focus on understanding it, and let our brain do whatever it wants to do to achieve that. And the exact form that takes will probably be different for pretty much all of us. We've got our own backgrounds with things, our own way our brain likes to handle stuff. So, and trust what your brain gives you in a moment, because it'll lean on the stuff it's already developed in other fields in order to pull it off. That's kind of thing. I would sort of don't try and force any particular type of model, anything you've heard of, anything you even hear me say as to what should be done or whatever. Always put your brain in situations where it has to do something and trust whatever it comes up with, lean into it. As a big push.
That's good advice. Yeah. And I'm sure it's reassuring to people who've felt like they're doing it the way they're being told and it's not, it's not working for them.
There's a lot of very well-meaning people out there that say that visualization has to be something, has to be a particular thing, or Benet's study in the 1890s talking about visualization has to be lines of force and all this kind of stuff. And anytime somebody says something that it has to be that way, all they're saying is that's how my brain works.
Right.
And, I'm assuming that's how yours works too, and that last part's not true.
And I know you've read a lot about these topics. And aside from sort of listeners doing a deep dive on your blog posts, like, are there any resources you would recommend?
So depending on the stuff, there's not a lot of information about this kind of stuff as it relates to chess. Most of our research has actually been in fields not chess. Especially this field around different types of visualization and working memory and stuff like that, huge leaps and bounds, especially in the last kind of 20 years or 30 years about that. Just those insights haven't made their way into chess yet. So I don't know about a specific chess resource other than my blog, I suppose. But if you want to step outside of the realm of chess and understand some of the underlying stuff, the book Thinking Fast and Slow, classic psychology book, is amazing, especially for understanding how your intuition is engaging with the game of chess and kind of how it overrides deeper thinking, that sort of stuff. The book Chatter is
I saw
fantastic.
You recommend that. Yeah, I wasn't familiar with that one.
It's amazing, especially for verbal thinkers or people that want to understand it. It's just basically a breakdown on how our voice works, why we have it, how it sometimes runs away with us, and kind of how to wield it in different ways, especially around emotional control, which can be really useful over a chessboard. And for the visual people, the book Visual Thinking kicked off a lot of understanding for me.
Okay.
Temple Grandin talking about basically being a hyper-visual person in a generally verbal world, which I think chess players are kind of the opposite, actually. I think most chess players feel like a verbal person in a predominantly visual world. But that's really, really good for just to understand kind of what's happening with visual thinking and the different minds that there are and how it all goes together. So that's probably my three
Excellent.
big texts.
And you mentioned working memory, which was the other major topic I wanted to hit. And you've written, as I mentioned earlier, you've written a series called 7 Slots, really going deep, explaining what chess players in particular need to know about how working memory works. And you refer to it as understanding or managing working memory to be the biggest challenge in chess, getting better at chess. But why don't we start just by your defining working memory and then take it from there?
Yeah, perfect. So working memory is the sort of part of our brain. It's like not necessarily a specific part of the brain. It's like a resource that the brain has that handles the information attached to whatever we're currently doing, whatever activity we're currently doing. So as I'm talking, it's your working memory that is keeping track of the previous words in this sentence to make the next word I say make any kind of sense. That's your working memory do that. It's the working memory that juggles a phone number while you're trying to find somewhere to write it down, or you're trying to put it in your phone.
Back when you used to have to remember phone numbers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Right.
The phone number metaphor doesn't work anymore. But
Right.
but it's still really useful. Like I bring the because the working memory's got a couple interesting limitations to it. We don't actually have much space in it. The idea is that something is meant to be held in working memory for a short period of time, as long as we need it, and then we let go of it. And it's this really important part of our brain that just allows us to do anything, basically. And various studies have shown that we can hold about 7 pieces of information in there at any time. That's kind of it's an average. Some people get 5, some people get up to around 9. But this idea of these 7 slots for working memory, that each slot can be filled by something. But it's this hard limit, is this sort of concept in psychology. And it handles so much in chess. Sort of as I learned more about how the working memory operates, I learned that it handles a lot more than just memory as well, and just remembering stuff. So if we have a big chunk of information, like a 10-digit string of numbers or something, and we need to try and hold that in working memory, we're going to struggle to hold it all just as a string of 10 numbers. We'll find it easier if we format it like a phone number, because it's sort of chunking it down into pattern that we're familiar with. And then so we get into depending on where you're from, the phone number is arranged differently. But you can end up with like a chunk of numbers in each slot. When we look at a chessboard, we're keeping track of information in the chessboard, obviously with our eyes, but what our eyes are seeing are being put into our mind, into our working memory, so we keep track of everything that's happening. And the board, in a lot of ways, getting chunked into different, so either some people it's geographical, like different segments of the board, for some people it's thematic, for some people it's whatever, but the board information is being chunked into a number of chunks in our working memory, so we can keep track of what's happening and make decisions. Where it gets tricky is working memory is not just about information. It's also it also uses our emotional control. It's also our self-control. It's also our thinking space. It's also our control, thinking space. It's also our self-control, ability to override our intuition. There's all of these roles that this same resource is handling. And chess seems almost expressly designed to put as much pressure on that working memory as possible.
Yeah.
Like which is wild. The amount of information we need to process, the amount of calculation we need to handle and sort of keep organized in our head, the emotional strain, the emotional control, the self-control, the endurance, all of these things are putting pressure on working memory. And when we run out of slots, we overload. Try to put too much in there and we overload. And overloading is, for a lot of players, sort of most commonly experienced as tunnel vision. So we run a big attack on our opponent's king side. It's all looking really good. It's kind of complex though, so we need to kind of knuckle down, calculate a few things out. And our working memory fills up really quickly. Think about this attack. We think we've got it. We played queen d4. We completely forgot the bishop existed on the queen side. It doesn't seem part of the play. Our working memory went, let's drop this information. We need more space for the king side attack. Let's drop this information. And we lose the queen in one move to the bishop. That doesn't happen because we're stupid. That happens because our working memory ran out of space and had to jettison something. And that can happen. That sort of jettisoning can happen when we when we get emotional, when we're taking up too much space with emotional control, when we're tired, when we're in a really complex position, when we've been defending for a long while. There's all sorts of reasons why our working memory would sort of overload in a moment and we'd forget some key detail that is obvious to us. And as soon as it happens, our heart breaks and we feel like idiots and all of that. But the reason for it is working memory capacity. It's in brains. It's really got nothing to do with our chess necessarily.
Yeah, well said. And I definitely I really feel it when I play OTB in particular. And of course, I wrote in my book, and it's come up in interviews, especially when I've had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Christopher Chabris about the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence and working memory, obviously very much in the fluid intelligence category, which is the one that does very slowly atrophy. It's safe to say when you're over the age of 30, maybe even a bit before that. And one thing I've noticed, Aiden, when I'm playing, and I think, again, I've probably mentioned this before, but one thing that happens to me, like I still feel like I can calculate a level comparable to when I was in my teens and 20s, at least if I'm in form, if I've been playing and training, I feel like I can. But what happens to me that never used to happen to me, and I mentioned this to Jesse Cry once, and he said the same thing happens to him, is I'll look at a variation and then go on to the next one. And then when I come back to my mind hops back to the previous one, I can't remember what moves I looked at. In that variation. And that used to never happen to me. And that's like a massive difference in your chess ability, over a large sample. If you're constantly having to either recheck things or just outright forget things that might end up being like a critical detail. So I know that you write in your blog post, a lot of it is about sort of more basic blunders, but even as someone like a more experienced player, it still manifests, I still feel it a lot.
No, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, that calculation clarity, because calculations obviously are entirely working memory.
Yeah.
And if you're in a branching calculation, for example, like you're holding this here, you go down one branch, you come back, you go down the other branch. But in order to track that same branch, your brain has to basically jettison everything it knew about the first branch. You come back to start and you go, I can't remember what happened over here.
Yeah, and as you allude to, it feels like this personal shortcoming, it really cuts to the bone when really it's like, what are you going to do about it? Which does get me to another question, but I don't know if you had something to add.
Well, there is some stuff like with any of this stuff, there are ways that we can handle it and ways we can do things that lean into what our brains are good at and give us kind of crutches and basically help our brain help us in those situations. So we sort of, when it comes to those big branching calculations, it's very hard to just kind of brute force it as we get a bit older. Working memory is kind of less spacious, feels less spacious than it used to.
Right.
We need to do things to kind of give a bit of help. There's something I've been experimenting a lot with my coaching students recently. I've got a few that have came with a similar issue, and it might help you as well. I basically call it the labeling method, and the idea of the labeling method is to give a non-chess name to each branch. So let's say you've got a basic thing is you've got a branching thing where you're trying to get the opponent's king to checkmate. Somewhere in the calculation, it branches, and the king could move to d8 or it could move to f8, and you have to kind of work out the branches in both directions. It can be really useful to have a working memory by giving each of those branches a name. So it could be left and right for d8 and f8.
David and Frank.
Yeah, David and Frank. Whatever works in your brain. Like we'll have different things that we'll hang on to. Those geographical ones can be really useful. And then you pick one of those branches to calculate. You calculate it to the end, to a logical end, and make a decision about it. And you consciously make a decision about it. And then all you need to remember is the name of the label and the decision you made. You can let your working memory let go of everything else. And it's just a structure that allows those kind of complicated branches, having to go back and recheck things constantly, all that kind of stuff. You name a branch, you get to a point where you can make a decision about it, attach the decision to the name, so you know left, I win a queen, right, checkmate. Okay, this is good.
Right. And
then you go forward with it. As you go into those branches, you might need to recalculate again a little bit. Like you might forget exactly what move need to happen here. But if you've made a decision about the point of branch, about the point where it branched, you can basically point as much working memory as possible to each thing where it's most important. And just hold, trying to remember what was the 6 move sequence that I kept over here. It's like, okay, I know this branch is good, and that's all I need to know at this point. That branch is good. I can point my attention over here for the moment. It just simplifies the whole thing. Like, so much of chess as an adult is working memory management.
Yeah, for sure.
It really is.
And what about, like, I don't know if they have it in Australia. Here in the US, there's this memory little game called Simon that's pretty popular with kids. It's like a little circular disc that has different colors, and you play the colors in a different sequence with different tones, and you try to build up your memory of like how many colors and tones. Cool. So my kids have, like, I had it when I was a kid, and now my kids have it. Yeah. And that's another one where it's like, it's very clear that I'm not as good at Simon as I effortlessly was when I was like 15 or something. But I've had stray thoughts like, what if I just decided I was going to like play Simon every day? Yeah. Like, are there outside of chess things? Like, is it a muscle that can be rebuilt? The working memory? Yeah,
for sure. It's definitely a work. Like, there's a bunch of stuff into it, basically, or studies into this kind of area of it. It was like, can you can't necessarily increase the amount of slots you have. That does seem to be like genetic number we're working with, but you can increase your brain's ability to like handle the efficiency of those things, to be just better at processing stuff, better at holding on to things, better at compartmentalizing, all sorts of stuff we can train our brains to do with our working memory. A big non-chess practice things, the NBAC exercise, which is just a sort of a basic number. You have a grid. There's a few different versions of it. You have like a grid of squares. It's like nine squares, and a number appears at the top, and you and like every couple of seconds, a new number and a new square lights up.
Right.
And if you're doing one back, and you're checking whether the number or the square that you're currently looking at matches the number or square that was one instance ago, one frame ago, I suppose. And that's one back. And most people can do one back quite comfortably. It's like, okay, this said 3 last time, it's saying 3 again. That's one back, correct. But you can expand that out. And with practice, get to the point where you're doing 4 back or 5 back or 6 back, where your working memory has to hold all of the various iterations of like the combinations of number and square that have happened for the last 5 or 6 settings to do it. That stuff's really good. General working memory. I keep my stuff focusing on the chess side of things because I figured I might as well practice the chess part while we're working on our working memory. But doing isolated, focused exercises with chess that are targeted to strain our working memory in different ways and get similar results.
So aside from naming different variations potentially, like what else could we do on the chess side to train it?
Cool. So I've come with about, I think I've got 12 different exercise types in there for the stuff that I do. And outside of exercise I've designed, there's a few different things we can do. One that I really like is reading chess books with an index card with a hole in the middle of it.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to bring that up. Yeah, that's a cool idea.
Cheers.
Yeah.
So I really like that one because when you can see the sequence of moves, so you're reading a book and there's a 6-move sequence or something, even some of the visualization books kind of have this issue, like how do you actually teach visualization, conceptualization in written form? It's really hard and it's a really difficult thing to navigate because if you've got the moves written down, if you need to remember where the knight was, you can just flick your eyes back to where the knight was.
Right.
And it relieves a lot of that pressure. And it's that pressure is, as we've been saying, like the pressure is what we need to force our brain to create processes in the systems. Every crutch we give it stops it from sort of getting the maximum value out of that training. So X card with a hole in the middle of it, so you can only see one move at a time and you can't see the moves around it, can be a big help for that kind of training. That's what we call recording audio of opening variations or games that you want to follow. So literally reading the moves out into a microphone and then listening back. This can be huge for especially learning opening theory. I've had lots of requests from people to do exercise particular lines because they just find they memorize the theory so much better when they're listening back to it, and they have to sort of try and understand what's happening when they can't see it. Like all those little details, all those little like, oh, the bishop can see this now, and this combination is being threatened, and this knight. All those things are just so much more deeply burned to our mind when we've had to process them only blindfold. Whereas a lot of these, it's hard to miss when you can actually see the board.
Yeah.
So that's really good for sort of non-my stuff, I suppose. But the stuff I've got things like what I call the lost piece exercise, which is an exercise where the auto tells you where basically all of the pieces are on the board except one, and then gives you some hint as to where that piece has to be. So it's like there's a king here and all these other pieces around, but the position is a stalemate. Where is what's queen?
Yeah.
And you have to.
And we should mention you've got a podcast that has a bunch like free podcasts.
Oh yeah,
yeah. That has a
yeah. I should definitely do that.
Yeah.
So that's the Chess Visualization with Don't Move podcast. We recently posted our 150th episode. And that's 5 days a week. There's 3 exercises every week. So there's plenty of stuff there of all the different kinds that'll target different parts of basically when you're working really different parts of the conceptualization muscle. And there's also some longer lesson sort of stuff where I've got some of the key insights from my research in psychology and neuroscience of things. And quicker lessons as well around particular concepts like chess memory versus general memory or whatever else, just like little quick starts. But it's 5 episodes a week at the minute. And it's slowly growing. It's been really cool watching that little number go up.
Yeah. I mean, it's well-deserved. And it's deceiving because the episodes are short. So on the one hand, you're like, oh, I could just bang this out, but then you're like, oh wait, I actually have to concentrate. When I do this.
Yeah, yeah. I got an email from someone the other day saying, I sat down to do a 2.5-minute exercise. It took me 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so with any of these audio exercises, anything in the podcast, which if this sort of stuff is resonating with people, definitely recommend going and have a look. Is like the core idea of it is to pause and repeat as often as you need to. This kind of training is a little different than most chess puzzles and most chess exercises. Like getting the right answer isn't really the point. It's about putting your brain in a situation where it has to struggle a bit and it has to come up with something. So if an exercise takes you, like you have a 2-minute exercise that takes you 2 hours, like it's not the last 5 minutes where you found the answer that matters. It was the hour and 55 where your brain was like trying to work out and it was going over possibilities and it was realizing that, oh, that square and that square are attached on that diagonal. Like every piece of information you pick up in that process is like burned into your brain from that point onwards, how much effort you've put into to coming up with that.
Although telling yourself that, it's like a slippery slope because you're like, well, I don't have to get it right. So I'm just going to spend 30 seconds on it.
Yeah. There's a happy middle ground somewhere. But yeah, so hopefully, plenty of stuff for people to have a bit of a look at through there. Yeah,
for sure. And then Aiden, this has been fantastically insightful. Really appreciate it. And Aiden, in closing, there was another concept that I thought might be helpful for our listeners if you deconstruct. So you talk about the 3 Fs, so freezing, freewheeling, and forgetting. What do those mean in a chess context?
Cool. So these are basically 3 responses that we find ourselves in during games, especially when our working memory is full or it's overloading. So we've got too much information, or we've got emotions coming in. Basically, our 7 slots are being overly full, and we're starting to really struggle under the strain. One of 3 things tends to happen. We either freeze, forget, or we freewheel. So freezing is what happens when our brains don't have any space left for thought. So maybe we're in a really complex position, and it takes a lot of effort just to keep track of everything that's happening in the position. There's just so many dynamic things, so many different calculations that we need to make, so many different things we need to change. And we find ourselves just completely unable to have thoughts. Like we just sort of feel stuck staring at a position, nothing's coming. And I think most of us have been in a situation like that at some point in our chess. That's freezing. So we need open slots for thought. And when we don't have them, we can often find ourselves completely frozen. A tip for how we might be able to navigate situations like that is to basically close our eyes for a moment, take a breath, open them up again, and look at the position as if it's the first time we're looking at position. So just try and allow working memory to clear entirely and look back at the position, ask what's actually important here, and try and simplify or sort of repackage position back into working memory in a better way. So that can help us give us the opportunity to reset a little bit. Thankfully, most of the time when we freeze, we know we've frozen. So kind of the easiest one to resolve.
Right.
We just need to simplify things in our working memory a bit. The second thing that we can do is forget. This one's a really painful one, where there's so much going on in a position, our brain prioritizes the things we're giving attention to, and it will let go of the things that we're not given direct attention to sometimes. What this can mean is things like, big kingside attack, you play the queen at g4, you forgot the bishop existed, one piece hang. It's like you're working around a space, it jettisoned that part. But other things can happen, like another thing we've all definitely done is you'll look at a position, the first candidate move will jump out at you. It seems kind of cool, seems like a good idea. You calculate, you decide it's bad, you lose a knight at the end of that line. Let's not do that. So you calculate a different line, and then that doesn't work either. So you calculate a different line, and it doesn't work either. So you play the first move you thought of.
Right.
And you play the knight move, which you already know loses the knight. And as soon as you let go of the piece, you realize the mistake you've made. That's forgetting. That's your working memory has just jettisoned that you already did that.
Yep. That's the one I described earlier. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, exactly. So those, and they tend to be the really painful ones, the ones that we have no idea how we made it, the ones that we really beat ourselves up for.
Yeah.
And they're just because our working memory overloaded. It's not even really a common skill. It's like, as humans, we're trying to play chess, which seems specifically designed to put as much pressure on working memory as possible. It's amazing we can even play it, let alone play it well. So that one's kind of the hardest of the 3 to resolve, because like Neville Longbottom, like we can't remember what we've forgotten.
Yeah.
And often we don't know we've forgotten it. So there's 2 ways we can resolve that. One is we can build up our working memory strength in general. So doing exercises with the podcast or the system, or with the book with the index cards, like build up your brain's ability to hold on to this information, make it more efficient in your working memory. So you can hold more before you start overloading. And habits. So when our working memory is overloaded, we don't have self-control anymore in the moment, but we can still hold on to our habits. So deeply ingrained habits, like if we've really focused on building a habit of blunder checks or something like that, then those things will be able to help us in the moment. And then the last thing we have is freewheeling, which is when our working memory runs out of space and our intuition gets far too much control, and we just play the first thing that comes to our head, right. Or we basically a pattern recognition goes through the roof. And even though the pattern doesn't work, enough of it is familiar to something we know that we just play it.
It happens, like anyone who's worked with adult students, like it happens so much. It's so common where they're just like, yeah, I looked at this, and I didn't know what to do, so I went here, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Door number 3, you know?
Yeah. And for adult improvers, like a lot of grandmasters and sort of really strong players will talk about intuition as this really important, really like this gift of the game. Like your intuition tingles, and you're onto something and you go. For most adults, like we get that experience sometimes, but the far more common experience for an adult improver is intuition gets in the way.
Yeah.
Intuition is ringing an alarm bell that we should do a thing, but that thing doesn't actually work. But our intuition won't shut up about it, and it keeps hitting us with hey, do that knight move.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah.
And that's probably, I like to think of like a phrase I use that is treat your intuition like a really enthusiastic friend rated 200 points below you.
Right.
So it's like they're really enthusiastic. You don't want to like squash their dreams, and most of the time they're going to play as well as you would. But 200 points in key moments, they're going to get really enthusiastic at stuff that's not what you would play, and we just need to be aware of those moments. So be skeptical of the moves that come too easily. Because that's intuition. When our working memory is full and we don't have that self-control, we don't have that ability to kind of reel our enthusiastic friend in, that's when we freewheel and it sort of gets free run and we go for the queen sack that obviously doesn't work. We sort of do silly things. But it's all rooted in just the fact our working memory ran out of space.
Good stuff. So did you come up with the 3 Fs on your own, or was that from your reading?
No, that was mine. Yeah.
That's pretty good, man. Well done.
Cheers.
Yeah.
I had to kind of shoehorn that last one, freewheeling. It took me ages. Like, how can I come up with an intuition word that starts with F?
Yeah, no, but it works.
There's not a lot of work on all this stuff in chess. I was talking about before, I had to like look at other fields and understand the core of it and just apply it. And my coaching work has been phenomenal with talking with a bunch of different people with different brains and different problems from all different skill levels, from like to beginners up to FMs. And it's been just really cool to see like, okay, how does the theory of like what's happening in our brains apply in this situation? Like, why are these hard to fix problems that we have in our game that traditionally the approach is do more tactics, or it's or is something that it doesn't seem to get it. There's a lot of players out there that if they could just clear up the one move blunders, they'd be 200 or 300 points better overnight.
Yeah.
Because every other part of their game is 200 or 300 points better than they are. They just keep hanging the queen. And that's not a knowledge problem. That's a muscle problem.
Well said. Yeah, there was a Feingold clip that went viral some years ago where he says, like, you know, if you play like a 2000 80% of the time and an 800, I'm paraphrasing, and an 800 20% of the time, then you're an 800, you know, like, you know, basically. Yeah. I
love that. That's amazing. I completely correct. Yeah.
Sad, but the truth hurts, to quote Feingold again. Yeah. All right. Well, Aiden, this has been fantastic, as I expected. So the website is called Don't Move Until You See It. The podcast, tell me the podcast name again.
Chess Visualization with Don't Move. Yeah,
Chess Visualization with Don't Move. Anywhere else people should check you out?
I'm also on Twitter, probably less active there than I should be, but Aiden at Don't Move. You can sort of check in with some of the stuff I'm doing there. And if anyone wants to go deeper into these ideas, the place I recommend it is on the site, don'tmovetilyousee.it. But there's a free 5-day course in there that goes like really deep into the kind of the core insights underlying all of my work, and lots of free exercises and cool stuff in there as well, for anyone who be able to explore. And reach out to me anytime through Twitter or through the website or whatever. I'd love to hear from your audience. Yeah, and to get your blog posts, like I know that we chatted a while ago, so I've been getting them. They're free for the general public? Yeah. So Two ways you can get them. So if you complete the 5-day course, you'll be on the newsletter sort of by default. I like people to go through the 5-day course first because it's the foundation. Like, it allows me to talk about more in-depth things in later newsletters because I know everyone's gone through that series. But they can also check out my articles on the site. So I've got the 7-slot series.
Sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
There. That's right. Got the 7-slot series there. Recently wrapped up the laws of adult improvement there, which is a fun series. It was like 8 parts or something. And yeah, a bunch of other ones approaching different parts of the game about our brain, and totally focused on helping the adult brain to get better at chess.
Yeah. And you started what I was rudely interrupting with you with a minute ago. You started cross-posting the Lee Chess, right? Recently. Yeah,
so I did a little experiment with the 7-slot series on Lee Chess to see the traction. I'll keep doing some more stuff on Lee Chess as well.
Yeah, and I haven't, I do link to a lot of chess articles in my Substack newsletter, and yours, because I get it in my email, somehow it like escaped my attention. Given what you've said about wanting people to go through the course, like, I don't know if you want me to start linking to your posts, but they are very insightful, so I'm happy to do so. I should have been. No,
that would be, that'll be fantastic. Yeah, feel free. I try to keep as much of my stuff accessible as possible, and when I use words like conceptualization and those sorts of more kind of inside baseball terms, I always link out to like an explaining page on what I'm talking about when I mention those things. So the articles, even without the course, can obviously have got lots of, are still very useful for people to go through that.
As an Australian, how do you know the term inside baseball?
Lots of American podcasts. That one I probably picked up. Yeah, that one I probably picked up from Merlin Mann years ago.
Well, sorry, what was the name? Merlin Mann?
Merlin Mann, which sounds like an Arthurian superhero. But he's, Merlin Mann was the creator of 43 folders, like in the early 2000s.
Oh, wow. Go way back. Yeah.
One of my favorite thinkers in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love his work. Nice. Absolutely his work. Merlin Mann. Many of the things I say probably first came out of his mouth.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, Aiden, it's been a lot of fun, and I'm sure we will be in touch online.
Done. Thanks so much, Ben. This was wonderful.